Imagine just for a second that you are standing right in the middle of a brutal, completely unforgiving desert.
Yeah, and you were just exhausted. I mean, you've been walking for weeks.
Exactly. And right in front of you is this massive, jagged mountain, but you can't actually see the peak.
Because it is entirely engulfed in these dark, heavy storm clouds.
Right. There is lightning flashing inside the smoke. The ground beneath your feet is literally vibrating.
And there's this deafening, sustained sound of a trumpet that just keeps getting louder and louder.
It's terrifying. I mean, your instinct would be to run as fast as you can in the opposite direction.
Oh, absolutely.
But instead, the person leading you says, no, wait, we are going to walk toward that fire. Because that is where our freedom actually begins.
It is a completely visceral, overwhelming scene.
It really is.
And, what makes it so fascinating is that this isn't just some cinematic moment of ancient mythology.
Right.
For billions of people throughout history, that terrifying mountain is the birthplace of law, of justice, and of community. It's really the absolute cornerstone of Western civilization.
Well, welcome to this deep dive. I'm your host, and today we are exploring one of the most famous, debated, and influential texts ever written.
The Book of Exodus. And I'm your resident expert, thrilled to be here for this one.
We are drawing from a really comprehensive analysis today by Chris R. Velasquez. It's titled The Survey of Exodus.
Yeah, and it pulls together some really serious historical scholarship, archaeological data, and deep theological exposition.
And our mission today, for you, the listener, is to move way past those basic Sunday school flannel graph versions of this story.
Exactly. We are not just looking at a simple rescue mission with, some plagues and a parted sea.
No, we are unpacking how this text functions as a really complex constitution narrative.
Which is such a wild concept. How do you take 1 million traumatized, enslaved people and build them into a functional society?
Right, a society that can actually handle the presence of the divine.
That is the crucial question of the entire text. And to understand how it answers that, we have to map out the architecture of the book.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are going literally from the dirt and mud of Egyptian labor camps to the highly structured, graded holiness of the tabernacle.
We really have to understand the history, the literary composition, and the profound sociology embedded in these pages.
So let's start at the very beginning, the cover of the book itself.
Good place to start.
Because right out of the gate, we run into this really interesting duality. If you go to a bookstore today, it's printed as Exodus, but that wasn't its original name, was it?
No, it wasn't. Exodus is actually an English word derived from the Greek translation of the text, the Septuagint.
Okay, the Greek translation.
Right. The Greek word is exodos, which literally just means the road out. Or, departure.
So it is a very action-oriented title.
Exactly. It frames the entire narrative around the logistics of the escape.
But if you look at the Hebrew Bible, the title is completely different.
It is. It's called Shemo.
Which means what, exactly?
It means names. In ancient Near Eastern literature, books were often titled by their opening words.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so the very first sentence of this book is, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt."
Wow. So the Greek title focuses on the event like the exit itself, but the Hebrew title focuses on the people.
It's about identity.
I actually prefer names, to be honest.
Why is that?
Because when you think about a massive empire like ancient Egypt, an empire built entirely on forced labor, the very first thing they strip from you is your individual identity.
Oh, absolutely. You become a number.
Right. You are just a brick maker. You are a unit of labor. But the text starts by saying, no, these are individuals with names and their specific identities matter to this story.
It immediately establishes the core tension of the book. It's this clash between a massive, dehumanizing imperial machine and a specific covenantal family.
The empire sees a demographic problem, but the text sees names.
Exactly.
But, before we get to the empire, we have to ask the obvious question. Who actually wrote those names down?
The authorship question, always a big one.
Right. Who is holding the pen here? Because the traditional conservative view that, I grew up with was that Moses sat down in a tent and just transcribed the whole thing from beginning to end.
Which is a very common view.
But when you dig into the academic scholarship in our source, you immediately run into these theories about composite works and literary strands.
Yes, you do.
You see scholars talking about J, E, and P sources. I mean, to a casual reader, that sounds like a corporate merger, not a biblical text. What are we actually talking about here?
That is a completely fair reaction. When scholars reference J, E, and P, They are talking about the documentary hypothesis.
Okay, break that down for us.
Basically, for the last couple of centuries, critical scholarship has noticed that the first 5 books of the Bible have these distinct shifts in vocabulary.
Like different words for God.
Exactly. Shifts in vocabulary, literary style, and theological focus. So the theory suggests that the text we have today is a tapestry woven from different traditions.
Got it. So what are the letters?
Well, J stands for the Yahwist source, which uses the divine name Yahweh early on.
Okay.
E is the Elohist source, favoring the term Elohim for God.
And a P.
P is the priestly source. That one is heavily focused on genealogies, dates, tabernacle measurements, and, ritual purity.
Okay, wait. I have to push back a little here.
Go for it.
If it's a tapestry woven together by different editors over centuries, and some scholars say it was finalized during the Babylonian exile, which is hundreds of years after Moses, how does that reconcile with the text itself?
That's the tension, right?
Because Exodus repeatedly says, and Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. It explicitly claims he recorded the laws and the covenant. Do we just throw that out?
Not at all.
Yeah.
And this is where the analysis we're looking at provides a really helpful synthesis.
Oh, good. Oh.
It doesn't force you into a false binary, where either Moses wrote every single syllable, including his own death in Deuteronomy, or it's entirely a piece of historical fiction invented in the 6th century BCE.
So there's a middle ground.
Yes. The most robust scholarly consensus recognizes a long, curated process.
Meaning there is a core reality that gets preserved and shaped over time.
Exactly. It is highly probable that genuine foundational documents, oral traditions, and legal codes originated during the Mosaic period.
Because Moses was educated in the Egyptian court. Right.
Writing down treaties and laws was standard statecraft in the late Bronze Age. He would have known how to do that.
That makes a lot of sense.
But those core materials were preserved, handed down, and eventually compiled. They were given their final, highly polished literary structure by later covenant communities.
Think about how a modern nation curates its own history.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
You have the original founding documents, the Constitution, the early letters, but over centuries, historians and leaders frame those documents into a cohesive national narrative.
Absolutely.
Especially if, say, Israel is living in exile in Babylon centuries later. They are surrounded by another massive empire, they are losing their identity, and a redactor pulls these ancient sacred traditions together to say, remember who you are.
Remember the God of the Exodus.
Exactly. He brought us out of an empire before, and he can do it again. The curation is intentional.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It is a highly intentional theological narrative. It's not just a haphazard scrapbook.
Right.
It's a carefully structured argument about who God is and who Israel is supposed to be.
Okay, so if the text is this beautifully curated theological memory, what about the physical reality?
The archaeology.
Yes, we have to talk about the dirt. I think a lot of people approach biblical archaeology hoping it's going to be a proof machine.
Oh, definitely. They want to dig up undeniable proofs.
They want to dig in the sand and find like a waterlogged chariot wheel with a license plate that says property of Pharaoh.
Which is just not going to happen.
And our research explicitly warns against treating archaeology that way.
It is a massive misconception. We have this modern forensic expectation that history should leave behind a perfect, high-definition video recording of every event.
But the ancient world didn't work like that.
No, it didn't. And it's certainly not how the archaeological record survives. Wood rots, metals are melted down and reused, and political propaganda dictates what gets carved into stone.
I always think of biblical archaeology like uncovering the scaffolding of a building.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, if you dig up the scaffolding, it gives you the exact dimensions of the historical reality. It tells you how tall the building was, how it was supported, what the neighborhood looked like.
Right.
But the scaffolding doesn't tell you what conversations the people inside were having at the dinner table. It provides constraints, but it doesn't give you the narrative interior.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. Archaeology illuminates the socioeconomic and political world behind the text.
Okay, so what does the scaffolding for Exodus look like?
It is incredibly compelling. Let's start with a document called Papyrus Brooklyn 35.1446.
Okay, Papyrus Brooklyn. I've actually never heard of that. What is it?
It is an administrative document housed in the Brooklyn Museum. It dates to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, so roughly the 18th century BCE.
Okay, an old Egyptian document.
Right. It's essentially a household ledger. It records a list of 95 servants belonging to a single Egyptian estate.
Wow, 95 servants for one estate.
Yeah. But the fascinating part is that 45 of those servants are specifically identified as being of Asiatic or West Semitic origin.
Meaning they are from the Levant, they are from the same ethnic and geographic background as the ancient Israelites.
Exactly. Now, does this papyrus mention Moses or the tribe of Judah?
I'm guessing no.
No, it doesn't. It is not a direct proof of the biblical Exodus.
Yeah.
But what it does prove is the administrative reality.
It proves that the background of the story is historically accurate.
Yes, it proves there were large systemic populations of Semitic foreigners living in Egypt, and that the Egyptian state and private estates had sophisticated mechanisms for employing, managing, and enslaving them.
It means the biblical backdrop Asiatics migrating to Egypt for survival and ending up as forced labor was a documented historical reality.
It totally validates the premise of the story. The world the text describes actually existed.
What else is in the scaffolding?
Well, we have to talk about the Merneptah stele. This is one of the most important archaeological discoveries related to biblical history.
The Merneptah stele.
What?
Is a stele exactly?
It's a massive granite victory monument. This one was carved by Pharaoh Merneptah, who was the son of Ramesses the Great.
Okay, Ramesses the Great, we know him. When does this date to?
It dates to about 1208 BCE.
And why is a victory monument so crucial? I mean, empires bragged all the time.
They did. But near the bottom of this monument, Merneptah lists the various groups he defeated in a military campaign in Canaan. And right there, carved in stone, is the word Israel.
Wait, really?
Yes, it is the earliest known extra-biblical reference to a people group called Israel.
Outside the pages of the Bible, this is the very first time someone bothered to write their name down. And he's writing it down to brag about destroying them.
Exactly. The inscription specifically says, Israel is laid waste, its seed is not.
Which is obviously classic royal propaganda because he clearly didn't wipe them off the face of the earth.
No, he didn't. But the historical takeaway is massive. By the late 13th century BCE, a distinct, recognized socio-ethnic group known as Israel was already established in the land of Canaan.
And they were significant enough that the Pharaoh of Egypt felt the need to boast about fighting them.
Exactly.
Which gives us a hard deadline. If they are an established people group in Canaan by 1208 BCE, the exodus from Egypt has to have happened prior to that.
Yes, it absolutely anchors the timeline. And the timeline debate usually hinges on one more major archaeological site, the city of Pi-Ramesses.
Pi-Ramesses. The biblical text explicitly states that the enslaved Israelites built the supply cities of Pithom and Ramses, right?
That's right. Well, Pi-Ramesses was the sprawling, magnificent royal capital built by Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, and it's located in the eastern Nile Delta.
So you have the capital city right where the Bible says it is, bearing the name the Bible uses.
Correct. And because that city was primarily active in the Ramesside period, many scholars point to the 13th century BCE as the most likely historical window for the Exodus.
Though some argue for an older date, right?
Yes. Others argue for a 15th century BCE date based on internal biblical chronologies, like in the book of 1 Kings.
Okay, but regardless of which century you land in, the archaeological scaffolding shows us a world of massive royal building projects
And Semitic forced labor.
and an emerging entity called Israel in the Levant.
Exactly.
But notice what is missing here. There is no Egyptian stele that says, oops, our entire chariot army drowned in a marsh today and our slave labor force walked out the front door.
No, definitely not.
And honestly, why would there be? You don't carve your most humiliating national catastrophes into public monuments. You carve the victories.
Exactly. Expecting an Egyptian imperial record to document the Exodus is like expecting a modern corporate PR department to issue a press release detailing all of their internal embezzlements and failures.
Right. It just doesn't happen.
Which is why the analysis we are examining recommends a very specific posture for readers today. It calls for disciplined confidence.
Disciplined confidence. I like that phrase.
Yeah, you don't need to engage in blind, uncritical harmonization where you twist archaeological facts to perfectly match a literal reading of the text.
But you also don't need to dismiss the whole thing as a fairy tale because you can't find a specific piece of pottery.
Exactly. You respect the historical limitations while taking the theological memory of the text seriously.
And that leads us right into the narrative itself. We have this socioeconomic reality of forced labor, but how does a slave revolt actually begin?
That is the big question.
If you watch a movie, the rebellion usually starts with a charismatic warrior picking up a sword. But when you read the first chapter of Exodus, the rebellion starts in a much quieter, far more subversive way.
Well, to understand the rebellion, you have to understand the oppression. Pharaoh doesn't wake up one day and arbitrarily decide to be evil.
No.
No, his oppression is rooted entirely in political anxiety. He looks at the Israelite population in the Delta, he sees them multiplying, and he's terrified.
He thinks they're a national security threat.
Exactly. He thinks if a foreign empire attacks us, this immigrant labor force might join our enemies, fight against us, and escape.
It is pure demographic paranoia. It's the fear of losing control of the labor supply.
So he institutionalizes violence. He implements corvée labor.
Which is what, exactly?
It's unpaid, forced labor exacted by the state, essentially state-sponsored slavery.
But that doesn't break their spirit or stop their population growth.
No, it doesn't. So he escalates to outright genocide. He orders the Hebrew midwives to kill every male baby born on the birthing stools.
And this is where the real story begins. Because the midwives, Shifra and Pua, are given a direct verbal command from the living God King of the greatest superpower on earth.
And they don't do it.
They refuse.
They completely refuse. And the text provides a very specific reason for their disobedience. It says they feared God.
Let's talk about that word fear.
Yeah, the Hebrew word there is yar. And this isn't a cowering, panic-stricken fear.
It's not like being afraid of a spider.
No, it implies a profound governing reverence. Their awe of the divine moral order was simply weightier than their terror of the Egyptian state.
I love that, because it completely reframes what heroism looks like. The first act of resistance in this epic cosmic showdown isn't a plague of hail or a pillar of fire.
No.
It is two working-class women committing quiet, systemic civil disobedience.
That's amazing.
They use their professional positions to sabotage the machinery of death, they preserve life, and through their subversion, the ultimate human deliverer, Moses, survives.
And, Moses' survival is drenched in irony.
Oh, completely.
Pharaoh decrees that every male Hebrew child must be thrown into the Nile River. Moses' mother complies with the letter of the law, but not the spirit.
Right, she places him into the Nile, but inside a waterproofed basket.
She technically put him in the river.
She followed the rules.
She did. And the basket floats right into the bathing area of Pharaoh's own daughter.
Which is just incredible. So the empire that decreed the destruction of the Hebrews ends up paying a Hebrew woman, Moses' own mother, to nurse the child.
And then raises him in the royal court with all the privileges of Egyptian royalty.
It is brilliant narrative irony, but Moses' royal status doesn't last, does it?
No. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He snaps, kills the Egyptian, and has to flee for his life.
He runs out into the wilderness of Midian, far away from the empire. He goes from a prince to a fugitive shepherd. He spends decades in obscurity. And then he sees a bush.
The burning bush. This is the theological pivot of the entire book.
Set the scene for us.
Moses is tending sheep near Mount Horeb, and he sees a bush that is on fire, but the wood isn't turning to ash. It is an unconsuming fire.
Which is physically impossible. Fire requires fuel. It breaks things down.
Exactly. And that is why it is the perfect visual representation of divine holiness. Well, the ancient concept of holiness isn't just about moral purity. It is about sheer, unapproachable otherness. It is an intense, radiant energy.
Okay.
Usually when the finite encounters the infinite, the finite is destroyed. But here, the divine presence is intensely hot and powerful, yet it refuses to consume the fragile earthly thing it inhabits.
It signals a God who can dwell with his creation without destroying it.
Right.
So Moses walks over to see this anomaly, and God speaks to him from the fire. God says, "I have heard the cries of my people, and I am sending you to bring them out."
And Moses, understandably, wants a resume.
He wants some credentials. He wants to know who exactly is authorizing this suicide mission back to the Pharaoh who wants him dead. So he asks for God's name.
And the response is one of the most debated and studied phrases in all of human history.
Hit us with the Hebrew.
Yeah, he is actually. In English, it is usually translated as I am who I am, or I will be what I will be.
I mean, it sounds like a philosophical riddle.
It can sound that way to modern ears. But in the context of the ancient Near East, it is not an abstract lecture on ontology.
God is not saying, I am the unmoved mover of Greek philosophy.
Exactly. The verb heia is dynamic. It is a promise of active, sustaining presence.
So what is God essentially saying?
He's saying, I will be dynamically present with you in whatever way is necessary. It is a disclosure of profound covenantal reliability.
But Moses doesn't find that entirely comforting, does he? Because he immediately starts throwing up roadblocks.
Oh, he has a whole list of excuses.
They won't believe me. I'm not a good public speaker. I'm slow of speech and tongue. He gives every possible excuse.
And notice how God responds. God does not tell Moses, actually, you are a great speaker, you just need to believe in yourself.
God doesn't validate Moses' self-esteem.
No. God simply points back to the divine name. Who made the human mouth? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth.
God's answer to human inadequacy is not human empowerment. It is divine presence. So Moses reluctantly takes the job. He goes back to Egypt, he walks into the royal port, and he tells Pharaoh, Yahweh, the God of Israel, says, let my people go.
And Pharaoh's response sets the stage for everything that follows.
He says, who is Yahweh that I should obey his voice? I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go.
That response is not just arrogance. It is a theological declaration of war.
Why is that?
Because in the Egyptian worldview, Pharaoh is not merely a political head of state. He is the divine son of the sun god, Ra.
Okay, so he thinks he's divine.
Right. His primary cosmic duty is to maintain Ma, which is the principle of truth, balance, and universal order.
So when Moses demands that Pharaoh release his entire slave labor force on the authority of a desert deity Pharaoh has never heard of,
Pharaoh views it as a threat to cosmic order itself.
and that leads us to the plagues. And I think we really need to camp out here for a minute.
Yes, the plagues are crucial.
Because the popular conception of the plagues is that they are just a series of random, terrifying magic tricks. Frogs, gnats, hail, like God is just pulling random disasters out of a hat to annoy Pharaoh into submission.
But the analysis makes it clear that these are highly specific, calculated judgments.
Yes, the text explicitly calls them acts of judgment.
To understand them, we have to look through the lens of ancient patronage and honor-shame culture.
Okay, explain that.
This is a public contest over who actually runs the universe. The plagues are a systematic, targeted deconstruction of the Egyptian pantheon. God is dismantling their theology piece by piece.
How so? Give me an example. Let's look at the first plague, turning the Nile River into blood.
Well, the Nile was the absolute lifeblood of Egypt. Their entire agricultural economy depended on its annual flooding.
Right.
Because of that, the Nile was associated with several deities, primarily Hapi, the god of the annual flooding who brought fertility in life.
So when Yahweh turns the Nile into a foul, bloody mess that kills the fish and deprives the nation of water,
It is a direct humiliation of Hapi. It proves that the God of the Hebrews controls the source of Egyptian life.
it's theological assassination.
Exactly.
And what about the frogs? That always seemed like a weird one to me. I mean, gross, yes, but why frogs?
In Egyptian mythology, the frog was the symbol of Heket, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. She was often depicted as a woman with a frog's head.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
So God essentially says, you revere the frog as a symbol of life. Fine. I will give you so many frogs that they rot in your bedrooms, in your ovens, and in your kneading bowls.
It takes their symbol of divine blessing and turns it into an inescapable curse. It is a deeply ironic judgment.
And it escalates from there. It moves from the water blood and frogs to the earth gnats and flies destroying the land.
Then it moves to the economy and food supply, wiping out the livestock and sending locusts to devour whatever crops survived the apocalyptic hailstorms.
And then it reaches the sky. The 9th plague is 3 days of profound, palpable darkness.
And you have to remember, the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon was Ra, the sun god.
Right. Pharaoh himself was considered the incarnation of the sun god.
So by completely blotting out the sun for 3 days, Yahweh is demonstrating total dominance over the chief god of the empire. He strips Pharaoh of his cosmic legitimacy.
It's a total blackout.
But through all of this, we have this incredibly difficult recurring phrase in the text. Despite his country being destroyed, Pharaoh refuses to yield. And the text says repeatedly that Pharaoh's heart was hardened.
Yes, the hardening of the heart.
Sometimes it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and sometimes it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is a theological landmine for a lot of readers. Does Pharaoh actually have free will here?
It is one of the most debated concepts in biblical literature. The Hebrew text uses a lot of nuance here. It employs different verbs.
Like what?
Well, there's kazak, meaning to make firm or obstinate, and caved, meaning to make heavy or severe.
Right, making the heart heavy, which is another Egyptian cultural reference, isn't it?
It is.
In their Book of the Dead, when you die, your heart is weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at truth. If your heart is too heavy with sin, you are devoured. So saying Pharaoh has a heavy heart means he is fundamentally unjust.
That is a brilliant connection and highly intentional by the biblical authors. Regarding the hardening itself, The text presents a complex interplay between human agency and divine judgment.
How does that play out?
In the early plagues, Pharaoh clearly hardens his own heart. He sees the evidence, but his pride refuses to let him submit. As the plagues progress, the text shifts and says God hardened his heart.
I was trying to make sense of this, and I started thinking about modern authoritarian dictators.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think about a tyrant who surrounds himself entirely with yes men. Every time he is confronted with a reality that contradicts his worldview, say a massive economic collapse or a peaceful protest, instead of yielding to reality, he tightens his grip. He doubles down.
Right, he refuses to admit he's wrong.
Exactly. And eventually, after years of lying to himself and crushing opposition, that persistent resistance to the truth becomes a kind of psychological and moral self-hardening.
He reaches a point where he is functionally incapable of choosing humility.
He is trapped in the prison of his own pride.
That is exactly the dynamic. Pharaoh's initial stubbornness solidifies into a permanent state of resistance. By giving Pharaoh over to the consequences of his own obstinate choices, God is enacting judgment.
The tragic irony is that Pharaoh refuses to release life. He refuses to let Israel go, and by clinging so tightly to his control, he ultimately brings death down upon his own house.
Which brings us to the devastating climax of the plagues, the death of the firstborn and the implementation of the Passover.
And I want to shift our focus here because up until now, the story has been about defeating Egypt. But our source analysis stresses that redemption in Exodus is not merely negative release.
This is a vital paradigm shift. Salvation in the biblical imagination is never just about escaping something bad.
It is not just, congratulations, you are no longer slaves, go wander the desert and do whatever you want.
No, redemption is an entrance into a new relationship. They are freed from slavery for covenantal worship. And the transition point is the Passover meal.
Let's talk about the mechanics of the Passover because it is highly specific and, honestly, pretty bloody.
It is. The Hebrew word is Pesach. God commands that on a specific night, every Israelite household is to take an unblemished lamb, slaughter it, and paint its blood on the doorposts and lintels of their houses.
And then what happens?
When the final judgment sweeps through Egypt, destroying the firstborn, the divine presence will pass over any house marked by the blood.
It introduces the concept of substitutionary sacrifice. The lamb dies so the family can live. The blood becomes a visible marker of faith and allegiance.
Exactly.
But what fascinates me is the scale of it. This isn't happening in a grand temple with a high priest. It is entirely decentralized.
Yes. The text reflects the socioeconomic reality of an agrarian people. The family household was the primary economic and religious unit.
So there was no temple yet.
There was no Levitical priesthood yet. The father of the house acts as the priest for his family. Salvation is experienced and enacted at the dining room table.
And they are commanded to eat the meal in a rush. They have to eat roasted meat, bitter herbs, and unleavened bread made without yeast, because they don't have time to wait for the dough to rise.
They are eating with their sandals on and their staffs in their hands, ready to run.
But the most important instruction God gives them isn't about the recipe. It's about the future.
He commands them to turn this meal into an annual perpetual memorial, a liturgy.
Why is that so crucial? Why not just write down a historical record and say, read this once a year?
Because memory is formative.
Yeah.
The human brain and human societies are incredibly prone to historical amnesia.
That's very true.
If you only have an intellectual belief that God saved you, it will fade when the next crisis hits. But if every single spring you physically taste the bitter herbs that remind you of the tears of slavery, if you chew the dry, unleavened bread that reminds you of the haste of your escape, you embody the history. You internalize the narrative.
You essentially remind yourselves, we were slaves, and we were bought with a price. Therefore, we cannot go build our own versions of Egypt. Liturgy prevents you from repeating the sins of the empire.
That is exactly the sociopolitical function of the Passover. It grounds their identity not in their own strength, but in God's unmerited deliverance.
So the meal is eaten, the final plague strikes, Pharaoh finally breaks, and he essentially kicks them out of the country.
1 million people tack up and march out into the night.
And this brings us to the most cinematic moment in the book, the crossing of the sea. But our archaeological and textual research offers a major geographical clarification here that ruins a lot of old Hollywood sets.
It does. For centuries, English translations have said the Israelites crossed the Red Sea.
Right.
But scholars point out that this is a mistranslation inherited from the Greek Septuagint. The actual Hebrew phrase in the text is yam soup.
Which translates to what?
It literally translates to the Sea of Reeds.
Sea of Reeds, okay.
It points away from the massive deep water expanse of the Red Sea proper, which is far to the south, and points toward the marshy lakes and papyrus-filled bodies of water near the northeastern border of Egypt, closer to the Sinai Peninsula.
Now, some people might hear that and think, oh, so it was just a shallow puddle. They just waded through a swamp. There was no miracle.
But that completely ignores the context.
Exactly. Even a large marshy lake system is entirely impassable for 1 million people on foot carrying all their possessions.
Especially when an Egyptian chariot army has changed its mind and is bearing down on them from behind.
They're completely trapped between an impassable body of water and the most advanced military machine of the late Bronze Age.
And the text says, God sends a pillar of cloud and fire to stand between the Israelites and the Egyptian army, while a strong east wind blows all night, splitting the waters.
They walk through on dry ground, and when the Egyptians pursue them into the seabed, the waters crash back down, totally destroying the chariots and the soldiers.
The empire is literally drowned.
And on the other side, the people erupt into song. We get the Song of Moses, and we get the introduction of a really vital character, Miriam.
Miriam is a towering figure. She's Moses and Aaron's sister, and right there on the shores of the sea, the text explicitly identifies her as a prophetess.
She takes a tambourine, leads all the women in a massive dance, and sings a song of absolute triumph.
Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea.
I think it is so significant that in the very moment this new free nation takes its first breath on the other side of the water, a woman is leading the prophetic worship.
It shows a breadth of leadership and spiritual agency that we often overlook in ancient texts.
It does. But as triumphant as that moment is, the euphoria evaporates incredibly quickly. Because the moment you walk away from the sea, you are in the wilderness.
Yeah, the wilderness is brutal.
This section of the analysis, dealing with trauma and exhaustion, is profoundly realistic. You have a massive population that has only ever known the regimented, predictable cruelty of slavery.
Now, suddenly they are free, but they are in a desert where they don't know where their next drink of water is coming from.
And their psychology immediately collapses into a mindset of profound scarcity.
Within days, they are complaining bitterly. They find water at Marah, but it's undrinkable. They panic. Then they run out of food.
And listen to what they say to Moses. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death.
It is a stunning psychological portrait.
They are literally romanticizing their own slavery. They are saying, yes, they beat our children to death and whipped us, but at least the meal schedule was predictable.
And shows how deeply the trauma of institutionalization had burrowed into their minds. Freedom is terrifying because freedom requires trust. Slavery just requires compliance.
That is a brilliant distinction, and what is so deeply moving about this section of the text is how God responds to their panic.
If this were a Greek myth, Zeus would strike them with lightning for being ungrateful.
But Yahweh doesn't do that. The text validates their physical exhaustion. God doesn't punish them for being hungry. He answers their fear with steady, miraculous provision.
He sweetens the bitter water. He brings water pouring out of a solid rock. And most famously, he provides manna.
Bread from heaven. Every single morning, this flaky substance appears on the ground. They gather it, bake it, and eat it.
But the manna comes with very specific rules. You can only gather enough for one day.
What happens if they gather more?
If you try to hoard it, if you try to stash extra in your tent because you are terrified there won't be any tomorrow, it breeds worms and rots overnight.
Because God is actively retraining their economy.
Exactly.
They are coming out of Egypt, which was an economy based entirely on hoarding, extraction, and building massive storehouses for the elite.
God is forcing them to unlearn the economics of empire and learn the economics of daily dependency.
You have to trust that the God who fed you on Tuesday will be there to feed you on Wednesday.
And the only exception to that rule is the Sabbath. On the 6th day, they gather twice as much, and it doesn't rot, so that on the 7th day, nobody has to work.
Even the daily gathering of food stops for rest. It is a radical departure from the ceaseless grind of Egyptian labor.
But speaking of a ceaseless grind, we have to talk about Moses during this period.
Oh, yes, Because managing the logistics of a million terrified, thirsty people is destroying him. The text gives us this incredibly practical interlude with a man named Jethro.
Jethro is Moses' father-in-law, and crucially, he is a Midianite priest. He is not an Israelite. He is an outsider.
He comes to visit Moses in the desert, and he watches Moses' daily routine. Moses is sitting on a rock from dawn until dusk, personally adjudicating every single dispute, argument, and legal question for the entire population.
He is the sole judicial branch for a million people.
Anyone who has ever run a startup or led a large team knows exactly what is happening here. Moses is bottlenecking his own organization because he thinks he has to do everything himself.
And Jethro pulls him aside and essentially says, what you are doing is not good. You are going to wear yourself out, and you are going to wear these people out. This is unsustainable.
It is a masterclass in management consulting, embedded right in the middle of an ancient religious text.
It really is.
Jethro tells Moses to implement a scalable system of delegated justice, find capable, honest men who hate bribes, appoint them as leaders over thousands, over hundreds, over 50s, and over 10s.
Let them handle the simple cases and only bring the hardest, most complex cases to Moses.
It creates a hierarchical judicial system. But there is a profound theological point here that we cannot miss.
What's that?
Moses is the great prophet. He is the guy who just split the sea with a staff. Yet he desperately needs the organizational wisdom of a foreign, non-Israelite priest just to keep the community from imploding.
It demonstrates that practical wisdom and truth are not exclusively confined to the covenant community. Good leadership requires the humility to listen to outside expertise.
I think that is incredibly validating for anyone in leadership. Even the guy who talks to God in a burning bush needs an organizational flowchart.
Yeah, definitely.
So the judicial system is sorted, they have water, they have manna, and they finally arrive at the destination God promised. They reach Mount Sinai.
And this is the architectural and theological center of the entire book. Surviving the desert is one thing, but how do you actually form a nation?
You need a constitution.
Exactly. The Sinai narrative, running from chapters 19 through 24, is where a loose confederation of refugee slaves officially becomes a nation.
And geographically, there's an interesting footnote here. Our scholarly sources note that despite centuries of tradition pointing to a specific mountain in the southern Sinai Peninsula, we do not actually have definitive archaeological proof of exactly where Mount Sinai is.
Which, given human nature, is probably a good thing.
Why is that?
Well, if we knew exactly where it was, people would have built a theme park and a gift shop on it by now. The text intentionally obscures the exact cartographic location because the theological function of the mountain is what matters.
Exactly. Sinai is the place of covenant. The organizing Hebrew concept here is Berit.
God calls Moses up the mountain and offers a formal treaty. He declares that if Israel obeys this covenant, they will be his treasured possession among all peoples, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
I was trying to conceptualize how this specific covenant actually functions. And when you read the text, it seems to operate like a hybrid between a national constitution and a marriage contract.
How do you mean?
Well, a national constitution establishes the laws of the land. It defines property rights, how to handle civil disputes, how to govern. The covenant code does all of that.
Right.
But the language surrounding it is intensely relational and exclusive. It demands total fidelity. It's God saying, I am yours and you are mine. You cannot have other gods. That is marriage language.
But the most vital takeaway, and our source analysis hammers this point, is the order in which this happens. Redemption creates obligation, not the other way around.
That is the defining characteristic of biblical law.
Right. If this were a merit-based system, God would have shown up in Egypt, handed them the Ten Commandments, and said, all right, behave yourselves perfectly for a year, and if you pass the test, I will free you.
But he doesn't do that. He liberates them first.
He destroys their oppressors, feeds them, and brings them to the mountain by pure grace.
Then he gives them the law. The law isn't a ladder they climb to earn salvation. It is the framework given to people who are already saved so they can actually learn how to live as free people without destroying each other.
That order of operations grace preceding law is essential. And when you look at the actual content of the law given at Sinai, you see that worship and ethics are totally inseparable.
It begins with the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments.
The first few commandments deal exclusively with divine allegiance. No other gods, no carved idols, do not misuse the divine name, keep the Sabbath holy.
But immediately after establishing that vertical relationship with God, it turns horizontal. It establishes how you treat your neighbor.
Yes, The Book of the Covenant takes those high, holy principles and drags them right down into the mud and grit of ancient agrarian life.
It outlines strict rules for protecting the most vulnerable members of society: widows, orphans, and immigrants.
Because God explicitly says, you know what it feels like to be a foreigner in Egypt. Therefore, you must not oppress the foreigner among you.
It is brilliant. It uses their past trauma as the exact moral justification for empathy and justice. You can't just sing songs to God and then exploit your workers. The law demands structural justice.
And once the people hear these laws, they agree to them. The section concludes with a massive covenant ratification ceremony.
Walk us through that.
Moses builds an altar, sacrifices are made, and blood is splashed on the altar and on the people, formally sealing the treaty. And then something incredible happens.
Moses, Aaron, and the 70 elders of Israel go partway up the mountain, and the text says they saw the God of Israel.
Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky, and they sat there, in the presence of God, and ate and drank.
It is a stunning image. A shared communion meal with the creator of the universe. The treaty is signed, the marriage is finalized.
But that immediately introduces a massive logistical problem.
Oh, absolutely. They have to leave the mountain eventually and march toward Canaan. How does this intensely holy God actually travel with an imperfect, prone to complaining people?
We established at the burning bush that holiness is like a consuming fire. If God just plops down in the middle of their camp, his sheer moral purity would incinerate them.
And that profound theological problem leads directly into the next massive section of the book, the highly detailed instructions for the tabernacle.
The blueprint for holy space.
Yes. The Hebrew word is mishkan, which means dwelling place.
God says, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. He wants to move in. But to protect the people from the lethal radiation of his holiness, that space has to be incredibly structured.
It is a system of graded holiness.
Explain how that physical space worked, because reading chapters 25 through 31 can feel like reading an IKEA instruction manual for a massive tent.
It is highly technical, but think of it as moving through concentric circles of increasing purity. The outermost zone is the courtyard, accessible to the people, which contains the bronze altar for sacrifices.
You have to pass through blood and atonement just to enter the complex.
As you move deeper, you enter the holy place, an enclosed tent structure that contains the golden lampstand, the table of bread, and the altar of incense. This space is restricted to priests.
And the lampstand is designed to look like a stylized almond tree, right?
Wow.
With blossoms and branches.
Exactly. The imagery of the tabernacle is meant to evoke the Garden of Eden. It is a mini-cosmos, a restoration of the original paradise where God and humanity walked together.
And then at the very back of the tent, shielded by a thick, intricately woven veil, is the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space. Only the high priest can enter, and only once a year.
And what is inside that final room?
The Ark of the Covenant. A golden box containing the stone tablets of the law, topped by the mercy seat, flanked by 2 golden cherubim. This is the earthly throne of the invisible God.
So you have all these precious metals, fine linens dyed in blue, purple, and scarlet, fragrant incense, and intricate woodwork. To build all of this, you need incredible craftsmanship.
And the text highlights 2 specific men for the job, Bezalel and Oholiab. They are the lead artisans.
And the text makes a point to explicitly say that God has filled them with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills.
They are empowered for metallurgy, gem cutting, and woodworking.
I have to pause on this because it blew my mind. Think about the entire biblical narrative up to this point. This is the very first time in Scripture that a human being is described as being filled with the Spirit of God.
It's not Abraham. It's not a prophet predicting the future. It's not a warrior winning a battle.
It is an artist. It's an architect and a metalworker. What does that say about how God views the physical world?
It says that beauty, precision, creativity, and manual labor have profound theological dignity. Aesthetics matter to God.
It radically expands our definition of spiritual gifting. The Spirit equips people for artistry and administration just as deeply as for prophecy. The physical creation of beautiful sacred space is a highly spiritual act.
But, as our source analysis points out, this beautiful, meticulous progression toward God moving into the neighborhood is violently, tragically interrupted.
We hit the golden calf. And I have to play the skeptic here, because when you read this on paper, it is incredibly frustrating. It honestly makes no sense.
From a rational standpoint, it seems absurd.
The Israelites just watched the 10 plagues dismantle Egypt. They walked through a split sea. They are eating miraculous bread off the dirt every single morning. They literally heard the voice of God booming from a mountain wrapped in fire.
And yet,
How is it remotely possible that a few weeks later they decide to pull their gold jewelry, melt it down into the shape of a cow, and start worshiping it?
but from a psychological and sociological standpoint, it is entirely predictable. The analysis unpacks this brilliantly. Moses has been up on the mountain, hidden inside the dark clouds, for 40 days. He has completely disappeared.
So the people are panicking. The guy who was their visible link to the divine is gone.
Exactly. They are experiencing severe anxiety. Yahweh is a God who cannot be seen, who cannot be easily predicted, and who demands complete moral allegiance. Interacting with that kind of infinite deity is exhausting and terrifying.
The golden calf, the eagle Maseka, is a psychological collapse into visible, manageable religion.
Manageable religion. That is the perfect phrase.
Yes. They aren't necessarily trying to reject Yahweh entirely. They're trying to localize him into a form they understand. A golden calf stays exactly where you put it. You can see it, you can feed it, you can dance around it, and most importantly, you can control it.
It doesn't demand strict moral holiness. It is the anxiety of the unknown driving them to create an idol of convenience.
And we have to look at Aaron's role in this because it is an absolute catastrophe of leadership. Moses left Aaron in charge. The people come to Aaron, panicking, demanding that he make them gods to lead them. And Aaron just caves.
He doesn't push back. He actively facilitates it. He tells them to take off their gold earrings. He takes the gold, he forms it in a mold, and he builds the altar for it.
It is the ultimate warning against weak, people-pleasing leadership under pressure. He prioritizes appeasing the crowd over maintaining the covenant.
He even tries to spiritualize it by declaring a festival to the Lord the next day, trying to blend the worship of Yahweh with the worship of the calf.
It's a total betrayal. The ink on the marriage contract isn't even dry yet, and they are already committing spiritual adultery. God sees this from the mountain, tells Moses what is happening, and essentially says, "Stand aside, Moses. I'm going to wipe this stiff-necked people off the map, and I will start over and build a new nation out of you."
It is the ultimate crisis of the book. Will the covenant survive human failure?
And Moses steps into the gap. He becomes the ultimate mediator. He stands between the wrath of God and the guilt of the people. He argues with God.
He says, if you destroy them, the Egyptians will hear about it and say you only brought them out to the desert to kill them. What about your promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob?
Moses stakes his entire argument on God's own character and reputation, and God relents. This crisis forces the narrative to reveal the absolute bedrock foundation of the covenant.
If the covenant relies on Israel's perfect obedience, it's already over. They failed chapter 1. The text reveals that the true foundation of the covenant is God's sheer grace and steadfast love.
The Hebrew terms are kenan and haset.
Yes. After the crisis, Moses asked to see God's glory, and God passes by him and declares his own name. Exodus 34 gives us this defining theological formula. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness.
Which goes on to become the most quoted, remixed, and repeated verse in the rest of the Bible. Prophets, psalmists, and kings constantly throw that verse back to God when things go wrong. You said you were gracious and slow to anger, so please forgive us.
Because it is the theological heart of the matter. God's mercy is deeper than human idolatry. The covenant is renewed. Moses cuts 2 new stone tablets, and the people finally get to work building the tabernacle.
Which brings us to the final chapters of the book, chapters 35 through 40. Structurally, reading these chapters can feel very repetitive because they mirror the instruction chapters almost exactly. First, God commanded them how to build the ark, the table, the lampstand. Now, the text meticulously repeats it all to say they actually built the ark, the table, the lampstand.
But that repetition is deliberate, and it provides immense literary and theological closure. The key Hebrew verb here is asa, to do or to make. The people finally obey. They take the divine architectural blueprint and translate it into physical reality exactly as commanded.
And it builds to this incredible, majestic climax in chapter 40. The tabernacle is finished. It is erected in the center of the camp. Everything is in place. And then the glory of the Lord, the kavod, descends. The cloud covers the tent of meeting, and the glory completely fills the tabernacle. It is so intense, so dense with holiness, that even Moses, the guy who spent 40 days inside the storm on the mountain, cannot step inside the tent.
It is the perfect bookend to the story. The book begins with Israel trapped in the dark, extracting clay to build store cities for a human tyrant. It ends with Israel freely offering their wealth and skill to build a dwelling place for the creator of the universe. The ultimate goal of the Exodus wasn't just geographical freedom, it was divine presence, God living in the midst of his people.
That is such a powerful image, but we have reached the end of the text of Exodus, and our source analysis insists that this story does not just sit isolated in the past. It is a controlling memory. It is the blueprint for everything that follows. Let's spend some time looking at the canonical ripples. How does this single text shape the rest of the Bible?
Our analysis provides a fantastic, redemptive historical synthesis. It shows how the Exodus functions as the grammar of salvation for the rest of Scripture. Think about the structure of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Genesis is the promise made to the patriarchs. Exodus is the actual redemption and the constitutional formation of the nation. Leviticus then follows logically to regulate the extreme holiness of the tabernacle they just built. Numbers details their testing as they march through the wilderness. Deuteronomy is the covenant renewal before they enter the land. Exodus is the hinge upon which the entire history of Israel turns.
Okay, that makes sense for the Old Testament, but how does this connect to the New Testament? Because I think a lot of readers treat the Old Testament as an angry, law-based rulebook, and the New Testament is a completely separate religion about grace in Jesus. But the scholarship calls this Christology. How does Exodus specifically point forward?
It points forward because the New Testament writers explicitly use the vocabulary and architecture of Exodus to explain exactly who Jesus is and what he accomplished. Exodus provides the template for the gospel. For example, early Christians didn't just view the crucifixion as a tragic Roman execution, they understood it as Passover-shaped. The Apostle Paul literally writes, "Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed."
Jesus is the unblemished lamb whose blood shields humanity from the judgment of death. And that makes the timing of the Last Supper make complete sense. It wasn't just a random Thursday night dinner. Jesus was intentionally hosting a Passover meal. And during that meal, he holds up the cup of wine and says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood."
He is deliberately echoing the blood-sprinkling ceremony from the Sinai covenant ratification. He is saying, I am enacting a new Exodus, not just from the political empire of Rome, but from the ultimate empires of sin and death. Furthermore, Jesus is presented as the ultimate mediator. Moses was great, but he failed. He couldn't even enter the tabernacle at the end. The book of Hebrews presents Jesus as the greater Moses, a high priest who actually enters the heavenly sanctuary and brings a redeemed people permanently into God's presence.
Even the concept of the tabernacle itself gets remixed in the New Testament. In the Gospel of John, the very first chapter says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But the literal Greek translation of that phrase means he tabernacled among us. He pitched his tent in our camp. The incarnation of Jesus is the ultimate, final fulfillment of God's desire to live intimately with humanity.
The pattern is identical. God hears the cry of the oppressed, God comes down, God delivers through a substitute, and God dwells with his people.
Okay, so that is the massive theological and canonical framework. But I want to bring this right down to the ground. Let's talk about contemporary public theology, because it is very easy to keep this locked in the ancient past as a cool history lesson, or to keep it purely in the spiritual realm of personal individual salvation. Jesus saves me, so I go to heaven. But the book of Exodus is intensely public. It is political. It is economic. It deals with systemic sociology.
It is highly relevant to how we live right now. The analysis emphasizes that Exodus gives the modern world a permanent vocabulary for recognizing and confronting oppression. The Pharaoh system didn't die in the late Bronze Age.
What defines a Pharaoh system today?
Wherever you see power being used to hoard resources, to coerce labor, to extract wealth at the expense of human dignity, and to dehumanize vulnerable populations, whether immigrants, the poor, or the marginalized, that is a Pharaoh system. And the book of Exodus makes a definitive claim. The creator of the universe is fundamentally, violently opposed to that system. God aligns himself with the slaves, not the empire.
It tells us that justice is not just a modern, progressive political talking point. Justice is rooted in the very character of God. A God who hears the cry of the oppressed demands a society that also hears the cry of the oppressed. You cannot claim to worship the God of the Exodus while exploiting your workers or ignoring the marginalized.
At the same time, Exodus offers a profound warning to those same communities seeking justice. The incident with the golden calf warns us against reducing God to a political utility. You cannot shape God into an idol of convenience just to rubber stamp your own cultural or political agenda. God retains his holy independence.
Exodus grounds our public hope in divine action, not in some naive utopian optimism about human progress. Because as the text shows, humans are incredibly prone to wander. We get scared, we build golden calves, we romanticize our own slavery, and we turn on each other. We are utterly dependent on God's grace to actually reach the promised land.
That is the enduring power of the book. It forces us to examine our own foundations. Are we building on the extractive logic of empire or the covenantal logic of grace and justice?
Well, that is a question that will keep me awake tonight. Thank you to everyone listening for taking this massive, comprehensive deep dive with us into the historical and theological architecture of Exodus. As we have seen today, it is so much more than a dusty story about plagues and desert wanderings. It is the definitive paradigm for liberation. It is the blueprint for justice. It is the constitution of a people learning how to live in the terrifying, beautiful presence of the divine.
It is a text that continually invites us to remember our history, to check our allegiances, and to ensure our communities reflect the character of the God who delivered us.
But before we officially sign off, I want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative thought to chew on, a thread for you to go pull on your own time. We have spent the last hour talking about the heavy hitters of this text: Moses, Pharaoh, Aaron, Miriam, the grand sweep of empires. But there is one character whose story is incredibly cryptic, brief, and yet holds massive theological weight. We mentioned her very briefly at the beginning. Zipporah, Moses' Midianite wife.
It is arguably the most enigmatic, shocking passage in the entire book of Exodus.
It really is. Our source analysis highlights a specific scene in Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. Moses is traveling back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. He is the chosen deliverer. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the text says that at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him.
It is completely jarring. The God who just commissioned him is now striking him down.
And it is Zipporah who reacts. The text calls the circumcision episode one of the strangest and theologically densest scenes in Exodus. She realizes that Moses has failed to circumcise their son. He has neglected the fundamental sign of the Abrahamic covenant. So Zipporah, a Midianite woman, grabs a sharp flint knife, performs the circumcision herself, touches Moses' feet with the blood, and effectively shields him from divine wrath. She shows incredible, quick-thinking agency to save her husband's life. So here's the challenge I want to leave with you. Go open up a Bible and read Exodus 4 for yourself. In a book totally dominated by massive patriarchal structures, by warring empires, by towering male prophets and priests, consider the absolute irony of this moment. God's ultimate deliverer, the man who will split the sea and bring down the law, had to be delivered himself by a quick-thinking, foreign woman holding a flint knife in the dark. What does that tell us about who God uses to advance history? What does it tell us about the completely unexpected, subversive ways that grace and salvation actually operate in the real world? Keep questioning assumptions, keep reading deeply, and enjoy the ongoing pursuit of knowledge. We will see you on the next deep dive.